If I were to tell you that the Indian teak changed world history, would you believe me? Well, stick around till the end of the episode and perhaps you will.
Between 1793 and 1815, England and France were engaged in a series of battles. These conflicts called for huge contributions from the territories that both these nations controlled, that is, their colonies. In this context, the forests of all of Britain's newly acquired colonies, and most of all India, played a crucial role, very little of which is narrated in our history books. Britain, as we know today, managed to conquer large parts of the world owing to its naval superiority. But where did the strength of the Royal Navy come from? Naturally, its foundation were ships. But what were British ships made of? Wood, teak wood. And from where did they get this wood? The forests of southern India. British ships were earlier made of oak, as that was the timber commonly available there. But the oak forests of England were fast depleting, and after the loss of its colony in America, Britain turned to the forests of India with vigour. In their book, This Fissured Land, An Ecological History of India, say authors Madhav, Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha. By around 1860, Britain had emerged as the world leader in deforestation, devastating its own woods and the forests of Ireland, South Africa, and the northeastern United States to draw timber for shipbuilding, iron smelting, and farming. In several documents of that time, the teak or the Tectona grandis, as it is botanically called, is reported to be the most valuable of all Indian trees. In fact, this period of war between England and France is referred to as a time of teak rush, which apparently had the East India Company going all out to obtain this most valuable resource. On occasions, it is said, destruction of forest land was undertaken by the English to symbolize political victory. As in the early 19th century, when after defeating the Marathas, the British East India Company apparently razed teak plantations in Ratnagiri, nurtured and grown by the legendary Maratha Kanoji Angre, to the ground. As oak trees and forests quickly disappeared in England, the Royal Navy needed to place their bets elsewhere for a sustained supply of wood for its ships. It was then that the Indian teak saved the British in their battle for supremacy against the French. Search parties were sent out to the teak forests along India's west coast. Teak was favoured because it was known to be resistant to insect attacks and consequent rot, withstand tropical climates, and be resistant to corrosion due to its oil content. Teak wood indeed played a key role once again in the following century for the construction of railway sleepers, and the forests of India would contribute yet again to Britain's World War efforts in the early 20th century. But let's keep those stories for later. Remember that at this time, Britain was not the only European power to be sailing out into distant seas, terrorizing native populations and taking forcible control of their lands. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, they were all very much in the race. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in France and Napoleon's ties with Tipu Sultan in India had England scrambling to scale up its naval strength. Napoleon had famously declared that as soon as he had conquered Egypt, he would establish relations with the Indian princes and with them attack the English in India. The defeat of Tipu Sultan in 1799 tipped the scales against the French and in favour of the English, consolidating British domination over large parts of the forests of southern India. Now, that is not to say that the French would have acted any differently had they gained the upper hand, for at the end of the day, the colonial powers simply mirrored each other in their insatiable greed and hunger for power. Any which way, by 1799, the Malabar coast of India was firmly under the control of the British. At this point, let's meet a chap called Henry Dundas, close advisor to the then British Prime Minister William Pitt and Secretary of State for War between 1794 and 1801, who played a key role in the French conflict through his proposition that England could win her wars against France at sea and through her colonies. Only a few years earlier, a report commissioned by Charles Middleton, the controller of the British Royal Navy, had concluded that England could no longer depend on its own oak trees to build ships and would soon need other powers for its supplies of timber. This had become a source of concern because while France could rely on regional sources within the European continent, England had no such backyard and would hence need its overseas territories to maintain a regular supply of timber for its naval ships, if it were to stand any chance against a rising French and Dutch presence at sea. Henry Dundas proposed that the English could make use of the almost inexhaustible forests of India to satisfy the navy's need for wood, and after the fall of Tipu Sultan and the defeat of the French, they did precisely that. They turned to Indian teak to build ships for the Royal Navy with a vengeance. In fact, so entitled are the English of those times that a geographer named James Rennell reports about the unpardonable negligence of which we are guilty by delaying the building of warships in teak for the Indian Sea. Studies now show that the forests in India, in fact, played a central role in consolidating the British Empire's strong navy and led to its domination all over the world. Tens of thousands of hectares of forest in India were put into service by the British East India Company for the purpose of acquiring teak. This in turn allowed Britain to maintain a very large navy at a reduced cost, and coupled with its military might and the shipbuilding expertise it found in India, they rapidly rose to become a global power. It is not incorrect, therefore, to conclude that one of the factors that led to the English enjoying a decisive advantage over its European neighbours, who were also out to colonize and control the world at that time, was their control of Indian teak. Further, while oak-built ships were said to last about 12 to 24 years, teak-built ships could last for 60, 70, even over 100 years. In this context, it is often said that it was the British who first introduced an organized scientific forest management in India. Firstly, that is a questionable claim. I have explored that in greater detail in this video about forest management in ancient India that you can check out. Secondly, the background and the motivation for organized forestry set up by the British is often not delved into. Here's what a research paper I found has to say about the matter. It is true that scientists contributed greatly to the introduction into India of European forest conservation techniques. They played a driving role in establishing genuine forestry systems. However, it was not only climatic, humanitarian, and ecological considerations in the European scientific community that motivated environmental protection policies in India, but indeed the global context of the wars against France that drove England through the East India Company to take measures to protect the military resource for shipbuilding. Teak. This subject is explored in great detail by Richard Drayton in his book Nature's Government, Science, Imperial Britain and the Improvement of the World, a book I have learnt much from and details from which I will be sharing in the coming episodes.
So you see, it wouldn't be incorrect to say therefore that the Indian teak was the bedrock of the might of the British Empire, after which the world was never the same again. In the next episode, I'm going to be sharing some tips on how to identify the teak and some interesting snippets about the tree. Subscribe to stay posted.